All right, so obviously over the last couple of days, we've gotten some absolutely massive news out of the Middle East as Hamas militants decided to launch a surprise attack into Israel. And there's a lot of videos that I can't honestly show you guys because a lot of this was pretty brutal. This initial sort of incursion by Hamas, you had a lot of people who were taken hostage. You had a lot of people who were civilians that ended up getting killed. And yeah, I mean, it's just an absolute clusterfuck. It's a nightmare. And, obviously that's on top of the fact that we are surely going to see significantly more civilian casualties that are inevitably going to come as a result of Israel's response to this. I mean, based on some of the statements that we're going to get into in this video from Israeli politicians, from U.S. politicians and other activists and, alike, it seems like this is going to be one of the most brutal campaigns against the Gaza Strip that we have ever seen in modern history. Okay, so it's an absolutely terrible situation, obviously. I just want to lay out a couple of things before we get into the actual details of everything that's happened. This is pretty consistent in all of my coverage of, Israel and Palestine, which is that you have a very massive and, easily discernible power discrepancy between the two sides in this equation. You have Israel, which is a very advanced military apparatus that is backed by the world's largest and most advanced military, that is the United States. And on the other side, you have Palestinians that have been faced with an ethnic cleansing, an ongoing apartheid, the expansion of illegal settlements into the West Bank, frequent bombing campaigns, war crimes in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is, I think, accurately referred to as the world's largest open-air prison, where they have no control over their day-to-day lives. They have no control over what gets in and out resource-wise. They are essentially landlocked. They are landlocked and also, blockaded by the sea. There's an embargo. The situation in Gaza is absolutely horrific. Okay, so I just want to lay that out here. I don't think that this is necessarily like a complex issue, as a lot of people seem to think that it is. Obviously, it is a terrible thing when you have civilian casualties on any side of any different kind of, whether it's a war or any sort of event like this that we're seeing. And so that's obviously tragic, but you also have to keep in mind the broader context of how this all came to be, why we're seeing this incredible, cycle of violence just continue and continue. And I think the most important point to take away from a terrible situation like this is that there really is only one side that has the legitimate power to end this cycle of violence, and that would be the apartheid government of Israel. Okay, so I just want to make that clear before we get into some of these details. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So the latest update, obviously, is Israel decided to officially declare war against Hamas, and this is going to mean a lot of different things. It's going to mean them trying to go after actual Hamas militants. It's also going to mean, again, a lot of civilians within the Gaza Strip and probably within the West Bank as well, getting caught in the crossfire. So let's go ahead and read some of the details here from the Washington Post. They start off saying that Israel formally declared war against Hamas on Sunday, opening the way for a major escalation in fighting a day after a surprise assault killed at least 700 Israelis. And I mean, keep in mind, this is like probably the worst attack that Israel has faced from Hamas in, I'm pretty sure, in history almost, at least in terms of a single day with the casualty numbers. So 700 Israelis are said to be killed at this point, and that number could go up from here. Reprisals by the Israeli military have killed at least 370 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And again, based on some of the statements that we've gotten from guys like Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, this number is, I would not be surprised, going to end up in the thousands and thousands, right? So they say the authorization of war by the Israeli cabinet would allow the government to carry out a wider mobilization of military reserves and use more military options. It also compels the government to identify specific wartime objectives, raising the specter of a ground invasion in Gaza, which again would be absolutely, a nightmare situation for innocent men, women, and children that would surely get caught up in the crossfires of that. They say earlier Sunday, Israeli forces and Lebanese militants also traded fire from across the border. So now you have the prospect of other, groups from places like Lebanon potentially getting involved in this as well, and maybe even attacking on a different front, which could, cause a whole bunch of different issues for Israel as well. And I mean, keep in mind, this Hamas attack ended with them basically taking control of several different Israeli settlements, and that, I mean, is basically like unprecedented, right? I mean, obviously we've had protests before, we've had rockets that were launched before, but this is something where it was basically just a complete collapse of the Israeli security forces, the IDF. It was, a misfire on a unimaginable scale by Mossad and the intelligence apparatus within Israel, which kind of gets into a whole different, number of questions in terms of how did that end up happening, right? How were they even able to be this successful when you literally had like Hamas militants that were flying in on paragliders, and basically they attached like what looked to be like a fan and a motor to like it looked like a fucking exoskeleton of a go-kart or something like that, and basically just fly over some of the fenced in areas and go into attack inside Israel. So the question again of like how did that end up happening? There's been some reports that have indicated that, well, maybe this was able to happen because the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence forces didn't have that much of a presence, along the border of the Gaza Strip that they otherwise would have had, because they were too focused on, protecting the, violent settlers who are expanding into the West Bank. So that's a theory that's been floating around. And again, that in and of itself would open up a whole nother can of worms in terms of that debate. Again, we also did have many different hostages that were taken by Hamas in this situation. They say festival goers, children, soldiers. What we know about the Israeli hostages being taken by Hamas, and this was an absolutely wild scene as well. There was some sort of, like some techno music festival that was going on close to the border of Gaza, and this was one of the first places that ended up getting attacked. And so again, you had some hostages that were taken from that as well. And we had a statement here from none other than Benjamin Netanyahu himself, which again, I think, spells a pretty dark future for the Gaza Strip. So he says, this morning on Shabbat and a holiday, Hamas invaded Israeli territory and murdered innocent citizens, including children and the elderly. They started a brutal and evil war. He says, we will be victorious in this war despite an unbearable price. Again, notice the language that he's using here. He says, Hamas wants to murder us all. This is an enemy that murders children and mothers in their homes, in their beds, an enemy that abducts the elderly, children, and young women. Again, I mean, these are all things that the Israeli military and government apparatus obviously does to Palestinians on a very regular basis. They say that slaughters and massacres our citizens, including children, who simply went out to enjoy the holiday. I mean, again, it's not just to both sides, this kind of a situation, right? Again, it's tragic when civilians are killed on any side of any different conflict. But, I mean, again, it's just kind of rich coming from a guy like Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, there were some military operations that took place, I think it was back in 2017, against Palestinians, where like over 500 children were killed in just one military operation. I think it was Operation Protective Edge. And so, I mean, again, like this is something where you're subjecting Palestinians for decades and decades and decades to incredible amounts of brutality and violence and murder of, the people who are living in, again, what is essentially an open air prison. And, you expect that there's never going to be any sort of blowback. You expect that there's never going to be any sort of, pushback from that. Now, again, I'm not justifying, Hamas's actions in this situation, but it's just sort of an inevitability, right? I mean, we've seen this countless times, whether it's the United States waging a global war on terror that spawns groups like ISIS. I mean, like, you can look throughout the history that I'll touch on at the end of this video of Israel actually towards the beginnings of Hamas sort of like encouraging and actually helping to fund and create Hamas as a sort of group from their outset, as a cudgel, as a wedge against the more secular and leftist elements that were within the Gaza Strip. So I mean, there's just so much deep history that's not really talked about by both guys like Benjamin Netanyahu and also obviously like the US media apparatus that is talking about this right now. But it gets even worse from there. He says all of the places which Hamas is deployed, hiding, and operating in that wicked city, we will turn them into rubble. Okay, so I mean, again, some people would interpret that and give him the benefit of the doubt, and they would say, oh, he's only going in to attack Hamas militants or something. No, that's absolutely not the case. I mean, last year we covered, the AP building, the Associated Press getting absolutely flattened, leveled to the ground, and then Israel turning around and giving some sort of bullshit justification of, oh, Hamas militants were in the Associated Press building and using it as a hideout, right? So, I mean, that basically translates into, they are going to attack anywhere and everywhere. There's not going to be legitimate, distinguishing between Hamas militants versus average Palestinian citizens, right? So they continue. He says, I embrace and send heartfelt condolences to the bereaved families of those loved ones who were murdered today. And the real thing that I wanted to just focus on here is this last portion of this that he says, I say to the residents of Gaza, leave now because we will operate forcefully everywhere. Okay. leave now because we will operate forcefully everywhere. Where the fuck are people who live in Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison, supposed to go? Leave now? I mean, again, this is the kind of rhetoric that, to me, shows that he's about to commit a bunch of war crimes and kill a bunch of civilians and then turn around and try to use this bullshit justification and say, oh, well, we gave them warning, right? Hamas, they didn't give anybody warning when they killed civilians, right? But it's okay when we, the Israelis, kill civilians because they're Palestinians, and we gave them some sort of a warning. I mean, there's nowhere for these people to fucking go. It's just an absolutely deranged and, borderline genocidal kind of thing to say there. Leave now because we will operate forcefully everywhere. I mean, again, that's him just saying we're about to commit a bunch of war crimes, right? So a little bit more, recent history in terms of why maybe this happened with Hamas at this time and what was leading up to this. And I think that you need a little bit more background in terms of the escalating violence from probably the most right-wing government in Israel's history right now, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, where you have guys that are in the government, guys like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is in charge of basically like the national police within Israel, or national, like Homeland Security, essentially, or their version of that in Israel. And this guy, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a terrorist. I mean, this is a guy who has openly, made genocidal statements against Palestinians, who barely considers Palestinians to even be human beings and wants to wipe them off the face of the planet. And, these are the kinds of guys who are in Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition right now. So it's an incredibly far-right government, and obviously that has emboldened a lot of, the expansion of these settlements that they have approved, expansions of settler violence, where a lot of these guys, these Israeli settlers will go out, they'll destroy, Palestinian property, they will try to take over their homes, they will burn down their crops, they will fill their water supplies with cement and pull up with guns and ammunition and just brutalize a lot of Palestinians. And so that's part of the context in terms of how did this boil up to this point that we're at right now. So again, here from the Washington Post, a little bit on that, they say the violence erupted suddenly on Saturday morning, but comes after a year of rising tensions between Israel and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, which has been under a joint Israeli-Egyptian blockade since 2007. This year alone has seen a spate of deadly attacks in Israel and the Palestinian territories, an escalation that followed Netanyahu's move to cobble together, again, the most far-right government in Israeli history. They say Hamas, which rules the Gaza Strip and carried out Saturday's attacks, said that the operation was in response to the blockade, as well as recent Israeli military raids in the West Bank and violence at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a disputed religious site in Jerusalem known to Jews as the Temple Mount. And they said enough is enough. The leader of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Deif, said in a recorded message on Saturday to the AP, he said, today the people are regaining their revolution. Okay, so that was sort of the Hamas narrative that they were going with. But I mean, again, you can't ignore all of this other violence that is sort of like a day-to-day reality for Palestinians and just pretend as if, they just woke up one day and they hated, Israel for their democracy or their religion or something like that. Like, no, there is obviously a lot more context that needs to be laid out here. Again, another perspective here from the Times of Israel. UN agency reports nearly 600 settler attacks over the past 6 months. And there are other individual, things that we could talk about, like the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh and a Palestinian American journalist who was shot in cold blood by Israeli security forces. I mean, so many different crimes and human rights abuses that have just been widespread, especially over the last couple of years under this new Benjamin Netanyahu government. And so this is all part of that same context. And so now we get to, again, the inevitable brutality that is going to be the Israeli response to this. So as pointed out here by The Spectator, they say breaking Israel suspends the supply of electricity, fuel, and other goods to Gaza, which, I mean, they're already in complete control of essentially all of those things, but this is actually not that unusual whenever Israel conducts these military operations, so-called military operations or defense procedures within the Gaza Strip. They frequently, actually do things like this, like cutting off the electricity, fuel, and other goods, which kind of, again, gives you a little bit of an insight in terms of the underlying problem here, that Israel can just do this to the millions of people that live in the Gaza Strip, right? And, another thing that I think is additional context here that needs to be pointed out is that, again, in this campaign, we're probably going to see thousands and thousands of Palestinians killed at the end of this, whenever the more updated numbers come out. But I mean, you look throughout modern history here, just from 2008 to 2020. I mean, look at the discrepancy here. I mean, this is what it looks like when you have, you know, an advanced military backed by the United States versus people who are essentially using like bathtub-made rockets for the most part, right? I mean, again, part of the way that they were invading into, you know, Israeli-controlled territory was on like homemade like go-kart fucking paragliders, right? So it's not exactly a fair fight that we're talking about here. But I mean, they put together some of the numbers, and it's just not even comparable. I mean, even on the worst year for the Israeli side here, 2,796 killed, and during that same year you had 19,860 Palestinians killed. And so I mean, this is just again sort of like an underlying issue with the current situation that's going on. Another thing that was troubling, in addition to some of the comments that was made by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, is some of the comments made by other U.S. politicians. I mean, I saw Nikki Haley going out there and encouraging Netanyahu to finish them off and use the full force of the Israeli military to go in and flatten Gaza, I guess. We also had here, again, pointed out by Mehdi Hassan, a U.S. congressman suggesting that 2 million people in Gaza should be collectively punished. Now, keep in mind, collective punishment, that's a war crime, straight up, for the actions of Hamas. And, I mean, this is what he said. This is Jared Moskowitz here, right? A congressman from the state of Florida, the 23rd district in Florida. And, I mean, look at how this conversation went, right? I mean, he says, this is Hamas's fault and only Hamas. Israel gives a warning to save lives. This is that warning where Benjamin Netanyahu delusionally said, get out of Gaza and go where? I don't know. I guess jump in the fucking ocean, according to Benjamin Netanyahu. And again, he's just basically saying this is the fault of Hamas, and they were given a warning, and so, if women and children are killed, who gives a fuck, I guess, in his mind, right? And so somebody pushed back here, this guy George, and he says, where the fuck are they going to go? Serious question, it's an open-air prison, and he basically says that's something they should have thought of. I mean, again, he's just openly endorsing. This is a U.S. politician elected to one of the highest chambers within our federal government, and he's just coming out here and saying, well, that's something they should have thought of. I mean, it's completely fucking ridiculous, right? You're blaming the entirety of the people who are already living under some of the most brutal conditions in the entire world in the Gaza Strip, and you're saying green light for, killing essentially any and all of them who, I guess, get in the way of this Israeli response here. So, again, U.S. politician basically openly endorsing war crimes. We also had here from the Biden White House, of course, unsurprising, coming from somebody like Joe Biden. This is, the support for the Israeli apartheid is a bipartisan issue through and through. I mean, keep in mind, it was just a couple months ago that I was covering on this channel, the U.S. government basically, or the House of Representatives, passing a bill that literally the only point of the bill was to come out and say Israel is not racist, Israel is not an apartheid, which is, number one, obviously objectively wrong according to every single human rights organization on the face of the planet that's respectable in the least, including some that are based within Israel itself, like Bet Salem. I mean, this is an objective reality on the ground, and you have the U.S. government coming out and literally passing legislation to say Israel is not an apartheid. We continue to support them full-throatedly. We'll continue to give them billions of aid unchecked, regardless of what they're using with that. And I mean, again, here from Joe Biden, he says, the United States unequivocally condemns the unprovoked attacks by Hamas terrorists against Israeli civilians. I mean, again, it's just so reductive. Unprovoked attacks. I mean, yeah, I would agree if you're talking like from the perspective of some random Israeli citizen who was at a music festival and ended up getting killed. Yeah, it's not their fault for sure, but unprovoked. I mean, you're talking about Palestinians, again, that have been living under, colonial rule, essentially. They have been living under an apartheid. They have been living under constant threats to their lives and restrictions on resources. They don't have control over their water, their electricity. I mean, just living in some of the worst conditions on the face of the planet. And then you turn around and you say it's unprovoked. I mean, some of those things I would think are kind of provoking, right? And you're kind of actually, if you're vehemently against Hamas, which a lot of people are, and, I'm not a fan of Hamas by any stretch of the imagination, but, if you wanted to actually combat the influence of Hamas, you probably wouldn't be doing things like the government of Israel is doing, right? It seems like that's almost more of a recruitment boom for Hamas because of how brutal you are acting towards the Palestinians living in Gaza, right? I mean, you are fueling that fire. It's the same thing as the United States going into Afghanistan, fighting the Taliban and then committing a bunch of war crimes and occupying the country along the way. And then guess what? You're actually going to radicalize a lot of people when you're killing their family members and, dropping, drones from the sky on their houses. I mean, that's going to radicalize some people, not exactly a long-term solution in the slightest, right? So, obviously a pathetic statement here from Biden, basically, again, standing full-throatedly behind Israel and all of the actions that they have taken. And again, as pointed out here by Amir, some helpful context on the situation in Gaza. He says you can't speak about Gaza without mentioning the 2 million Palestinians who are imprisoned, 95% of water is undrinkable, 4 hours of electricity per day, 45% unemployment, and 52% of the youth expressing no will to live. You can't speak about Gaza without mentioning the decades of Israeli tyranny and terror, and I think that's 100% correct. Again, just to back up the same point that every respectable human rights organization has made on the face of the planet. You also had guys like the former chief of Mossad, which is like their version of the CIA, right, coming out and saying Israel is imposing an apartheid on the Palestinians, right? I don't know how much more you could be asking for to give an accurate description of that situation when you have the head or the former chief of Mossad coming out and admitting it, probably one of the last people on the planet that has an incentive to come out and say something like that. And so I'll leave you here with a couple of different resources here that I think you guys should go watch. I'll link them down in the description if you want to get a little bit more context on the history of this and why I take the position that I do. I'll play a little bit of this Michael Brooks video from back in the day on why it's not really a complicated issue in the broader picture of this, so-called conflict or whatever. And I'll also link down below a couple of other videos that I saw that were coming across my timeline that I thought were pretty good right here from Double Down News. They have a breakdown on some of the history just in less than 10 minutes. And also the Means TV made Gaza Fights for Freedom, which was created by Abby Martin, free. So I'll link that down below as well. It's a great documentary if you want to get a perspective in terms of what the people living in Gaza are actually going with. And I'll also link down below if you want a little bit more information on how Israel was actually helping to sort of support Hamas at its outset, again, basically just as a cudgel against the more secular and leftist elements within the Gaza Strip at the time. And so basically, let's just go ahead and watch a little bit of this Michael Brooks clip because I think he summarizes it in a really effective way.
That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive on their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question,
I mean, he puts it out there, I think, pretty eloquently, right? I mean, that's the real situation here, right? It's complicated only in the sense that it's complicated for Americans because Americans don't really understand the full context and scope of what Palestinians have been subjected to for decades and decades and decades with the, again, full-throated support of the United States government, of the United States military-industrial complex. And, I mean, that's the reality of this, right? I mean, if this wasn't some, Arabs or if this wasn't some, like, Muslim Palestinians, then I think Americans would be viewing it differently. And I thought one of the greatest ironies that I saw floating around on Twitter is you have so many people who have Ukraine flags in their name tags or in their bios, and they're coming out and basically, again, pushing for Israel to have like the most brutal crackdown on Palestinians living in Gaza you could possibly imagine, and criticizing Hamas and vehemently for attacking Israel, which again, like, you can have a nuanced critique there for sure. Criticize the attacking of civilians 100% every day of the week. But I mean, again, this is sort of just like inevitable, right? I mean, in the same way that Russia has occupied Ukrainian territory, and if that's one of the wars that you've been seriously focused on and trying to advocate for Ukraine to be able to take back every inch of territory that Russia has taken from them, go look at a map of the history of Palestinian territory being eroded over time by the government of Israel. I mean, again, to me, this isn't a really complicated issue, as Michael Brooks just laid it out there. It's really not. It's not complex unless your feelings on apartheid, your feelings on a slow-rolling ethnic cleansing are mixed feelings, which I don't think that anybody who has any real core principles or sense of morality should feel conflicted about any of those things. So I'll leave it off there. Obviously, again, this is a tragic situation. You mourn the loss of life, both of, innocent civilians, Israelis that were killed, and, inevitably the, potentially thousands of people that are going to be killed, innocents and alike in Gaza. So, you feel for all of the people involved in this. It's a tragic situation. And, again, I'll just leave you with this. I think that this was a perfect synopsis here from Giannis. He says, the path to ending the tragic loss of life, or innocent lives, both Palestinian and Israeli, begins with one crucial step: the end of the Israeli occupation and apartheid. And I think that that's my real takeaway from this, and pretty much the entirety of any of these kinds of situations that we have been tracking on this channel for years and years at this point, with Palestine and Israel. There's one side that has the power to actually end this, and it's certainly not the people who have been living under decades and decades of a brutal occupation, expansion of illegal settlements, threats, and violence from settlers and the Israeli military forces and security forces as well. There's one side that actually has the power to make a real difference and prevent this ongoing cycle of violence, and that is the government of Israel.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying